If you're deconstructing, you've probably noticed something. Sin is not just a doctrine. It's often a weapon used to make people conform. And today I want to talk about what that has done to the lives of real people. Now let me be clear right up front. This is not one of those Christianity is stupid videos, perhaps most obviously because I am a Christian. Rather, what I'm talking about today is going to be a lot more specific, because you see, sin started off as a diagnostic tool. It was a way of asking, what is wrong with us? And you know what I'm talking about? It's the questions that we have, like, why do we hurt each other? Why do we sabotage love? Why do we keep doing those things that we hate? And overall, that question, what is wrong with us, is a question that's valid, and we need to wrestle with it today. But just as in any medicinal field, a good diagnosis can lead to healing, and a misdiagnosis can lead to harm. And in many churches, the concept of sin isn't just an outdated theology. Far more than that, it has been used to do harm to real people. Because once you label someone as sinful, then you can control them through shame, through fear, and through rejection. And today I want to talk about just that. And as we near the end of this video, I want to walk into the darkest corner of this conversation, that place that churches really don't want to deal with. But before we get there, we first must ask, how in the world did we get here in the first place? The word sin isn't just about behavior, it's about human nature. In other words, it's not something that you do, it's something that you are. You are a sinner. And once sin moves from behavior to identity, everything shifts. Because you are no longer someone who does harm from time to time, someone who does bad things from time to time. Now you become someone who is fundamentally corrupted. You are fundamentally broken. And that is no small theological move. It affects everything. It affects your entire outlook on life. When your starting point is corruption rather than, say, dignity, then your spiritual life is built upon suspicion. Suspicion of desire, suspicion of your thoughts, suspicion of your own inner voice. And at that point, we are no longer talking about just theology, because it's actively shaping your psyche. When people deconstruct, I think they eventually get to the point where they notice something, where they go, wait, I was taught to distrust myself. And then they start tracing that distrust back to that core idea, the idea that at the center of who they are, there is something defective. Now, I realize that there are defenders of the language of sin who are going to want to disagree and say, oh, no, that's not what it's about at all. It's about the way we live, having a sense of moral responsibility. But the truth is that lived experience for many tells a completely different story. Because you see, for many people, sin was not a mirror, it was a verdict. And that leads to a sense of shame. And actually, it's even more than that. It's not just a matter of shame. We're talking about a sense of sacred shame, which is a cosmic sense of shame. And that can have an incredibly powerful effect on someone's life, especially if they grow up being taught that. If you tell a child that they are broken from the very beginning, that becomes the emotional architecture of their spirituality. It doesn't create humility, it creates hypervigilance. It creates a low-grade anxiety that something inside you is always going to be wrong. And this is not accidental. This is the actual fruit of the teaching. In fact, this is the whole point of the teaching. And when we frame human beings primarily as sinners, as opposed to, say, divine image bearers, their human dignity becomes secondary. And this is really important. What you emphasize shapes what people will experience in their lives. When sin eclipses the dignity that comes with being born into the image of God, then shame eclipses trust. And by the way, if this is a topic that is of great interest to you, I want you to know that you are in the right place, because I create videos for progressive Christians, questioners, and the church alumni. And you know who they are. Those are the people who live on the edge of faith, whether they still sit in the pews or whether they've left the church behind entirely. But if this is you, make sure you like and subscribe so we can stay connected. Eventually, those children are going to grow into youth and their sexuality is going to emerge. And when sin language saturates sexuality, deeper issues take root. Desire becomes suspicious. Pleasure becomes risky. The body becomes a potential liability. And this leads not only to sexual anxiety, but it leads to spiritual fragmentation, because now the self is divided into two. It's spirit versus flesh. It's holiness versus humanity. And rather than seeing the body as an important part of our spirituality, it actually becomes the enemy. And it's all because of how sin is used as a primary frame for understanding the human condition. And that framework then becomes incredible leverage for control. Many years ago, I was in an online chat conversation with an anonymous woman who shared her story with me. She said her husband would regularly become drunk and then start to get physically aggressive. Now, looking for help, she went to her pastor, and her pastor and a religious counselor apparently agreed that when the husband started drinking and then started to escalate, she could take the children and leave for the house. But here's the thing. She could only leave for a couple of hours, no more. The point was to give him time to sober up a bit and calm down. After that couple of hours, though, she had to return to him. Why? Well, it was because the husband had been made the head of the household by Christ. And to defy his authority as the head of the household by not going back would be to sin against Christ. Furthermore, divorce wasn't an option, because that was a covenant made in Christ. And to break that covenant would be to sin against, you guessed it, Christ. To be clear, she did eventually leave her husband with the kids and seek protection. But what I want you to hear in that story is the extent to which the language of sin was used to supercharge social control. Submission was enforced even when physical aggression was involved. And arguably, this is not an anomaly in Christian history. The language of sin has commonly been used to protect and enforce systems of privilege and power. And I think the most uncomfortable part about all of this is this. In many cases, sin is not just a word that is used to identify harm, but is actually a word intentionally used to justify it. And once you see this, every single time you hear the word sin, it's going to start making you pause and wonder, wait a second, what's really going on here? And this is where we go all the way back to the purpose of the concept of sin in the first place. The whole point of sin was that it was a diagnostic tool to understand the human condition. But what happens when we apply that diagnostic tool today? Anxiety becomes a lack of faith. Depression becomes spiritual failure. Trauma responses become rebellion against God. In other words, we get misdiagnoses. And those misdiagnoses then have created a lot of harm in this world. And it's not because the people who are talking about sin are necessarily malicious or anything like that. It's just simply because the diagnostic tool itself is very, very outdated. Today we have much better tools to understand the human condition. We have biology, psychology, neuroscience, trauma studies. All of these wonderful ways to understand the human condition that are much better than what we've had in the past. And all of this raises a significant question. If we can describe the human condition more precisely than we've ever been able to do so in history using today's diagnostic tools, then what is the language of sin actually adding to the equation? Clarity? Confusion? Or maybe something else? And this brings us to the darkest corner of this conversation. When religious language tells LGBTQ youth that who they are is especially sinful because of their sexual orientation or identities, That is not a behavioral critique. That is an identity-level condemnation. And research consistently shows us what common sense already tells us. Rejection increases risk, and acceptance protects. Studies have shown that when a household uses the language of sin to describe LGBTQ sexuality, teenagers are twice as likely to unalive themselves than normal. Meanwhile, when such language is not applied to their sexuality in the household, they are half as likely to unalive themselves than normal. This is not about abstract theological concepts. For many, this is about remaining alive versus becoming unalive. When a category repeatedly produces despair in vulnerable populations, we have to ask whether the category itself inherently carries more harm in it than potential for healing. So here's the tension that I'm sitting with. If a concept consistently produces shame, control, and social rejection and is ultimately a misdiagnosis, then is the problem merely just the misuse of that word? Or is the category itself so entangled with cultural baggage that it just cannot be salvaged at all? And maybe at one time the word sin was able to name something very real for people. It was able to identify our issues with harm and rupture and alienation as human beings. But words are not neutral containers. They accumulate meanings historically. And the history of sin is a very heavy one. And in fact, it's so heavy that for many people, it can no longer even begin to point toward healing at all, because it can only point toward personal condemnation. And if a word no longer functions the way it was meant to, then maybe we should be asking whether keeping it and continuing to use it is wisdom, or is it just simply nostalgia? This video is part of a series. Last week, I looked at original sin. This week, we've looked at what happens when sin becomes a misdiagnosis that does harm. Next week, I want to take it even further and explore whether we need a new framework for sin altogether. Because here's the real question I'm wrestling with, and I'd love to hear from you. Is sin an outdated concept that we should just really let go of once and for all? Or is it something worth keeping, even if that means we need to rethink it and maybe redefine it? Let me know in the comments. I really do read them. As I move forward, I'm not going to defend tradition blindly, and I am not going to burn it down recklessly either. So if you want to follow the rest of the series, make sure you like and subscribe. I'm Bo McGuffey of the Evolving Christian Faith Network. Until next time, peace.